Okay, first, I'd like to check that everybody's still here. Can I check that opening government's here?
We're here.
Cool. Opening opposition,
Yeah, we can.
closing government,
Here.
closing opposition.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to do call, a little bit of general feedback, and then justification for the call. The call goes as follows. The first goes to closing opposition, the second goes to opening opposition, the third goes to opening government, and the fourth, unfortunately, goes to closing government. I think that something that this debate kind of struggled with was there was a slight lack of direct engagement with the comparative, right? Or direct engagement with your side of the comparative almost, which is a little bit of a weird place to be in. But I think that there was a lot of people saying the other side is going to be bad for this reason, and this reason, and then not explaining why your side would be better. I think this is maybe a little bit more of an opposition problem than a government problem, but I think all teams fell to it, and I think it did harm everybody to an extent. But okay, let's go through the debate and how it played out. Beginning with opening government. Opening government starts off with some framing, right? The framing that opening government tells me is that South America is unique because there are weak governments, preoccupied governments, colonial histories. So this means that living in gated communities means that one, these places are mostly white and wealthy, and two, there are there's a lot of freedom on these places making decisions about who's being allowed into these communities in the first place. And then that this creates little interaction between people who are inside these gated communities versus people who are outside of these gated communities. And this basically creates a little town with its own rules. I think the first push I get from opening government then is basically discrimination is a bad thing. Banning gated communities will solve discrimination to an extent, right? Okay, here's the first thing that I think I have a problem with this particular push. I feel like you don't necessarily prove to me in a vacuum that discrimination is necessarily good or is necessarily bad, or that it is necessarily worse than the alternatives, right? I think in this debate specifically, you probably have a burden to prove to me that I care more about allowing a more diverse community into these gated communities than I do about these people within these communities being safe to begin with, right? And I think I probably do care about some level of discrimination mitigation. I think this is fair. But I think insofar as you can't prove to me that the alternative is going to be these people, whenever these gated communities are banned, these people scatter to all of these various different zip codes, and then this significantly changes the way that income is distributed, the way that income taxes are gathered, and where this these finances go to in the first place. I think what I am left with is the main thing that I get relatively well proven from opening government is that if you ban gated communities, they will no longer have this wall around them, so they will no longer be able to function as a town with their own little rules. This means that there will be more diversity on who is allowed into the community in the first place because you can't stop someone from buying a house anymore. I think this is fair enough. I think this probably does reduce discrimination. However, I think it really only ends up impacting mainly the people who are at the highest end of the income. Yeah, okay. So the highest end of the income bracket. Yeah, okay. So then playing in opening opposition into this. Opening opposition basically says there are two options whenever you ban these gated communities. Either number one, you're going to ban these gated communities and literally everyone is going to who was in these communities is going to leave, right? This is probably going to happen for the richest people. The richest people are probably going to leave. This is going to cause some levels of issues as far as there's less wealth going into infrastructure, less wealth, etc. There's trickle down impacts to this, right? But the second thing is what happens for the people who do not necessarily leave? What happens for the people who do not necessarily leave is that for whatever reason, I think they give me a lot of reasons why you probably wouldn't want to leave necessarily, is that these people are still afraid because you cannot stop the fact that they live in a society that they believe is at least somewhat unstable because of the framing that I believe does in fact come out of opening government, where it's the government is weak, the government is unable to protect you. So because they have this fear or this perception of an inability of the government to protect them, then what ends up happening is even though they stay, they hire private militias so that they can function as though they're part of a gated community without actually being a part of the gated community, right? And I think this looks like this security just being less effective is what they tell me, but then this security also being more violent because it is less effective. There's less of a deterrence effect. People are more likely to try things like stealing, like breaking in, stuff like that. And this is then reacted to with disproportionate violence, which then spikes violence in the community as a whole, right? Um, I feel like this is relatively well proven in Leader of Opposition. But then I think whenever we add on Deputy, I think what Deputy tells me also like kind of attacks the contact theory, kind of like less discrimination whenever you no longer have these barriers thing that comes out of opening government in the first place. And then I think secondarily, like opening opposition is able to like explain that you should prioritize a lack of vigilantism, which is like resistance against the state. That's like probably going to be a bad thing. But like you should also prioritize self protection and like just fewer people dying over like some level of discrimination. The change of which I'm slightly uncertain on. I think I'm also slightly uncertain on scale and opening opposition as well. But I feel like if I am uncertain on scale for both of these things, I think I probably prioritize there are fewer people who die, and I probably buy that this happens in a large number of cases because people are so very scared, as has been characterized, and I think is insufficiently pushed back against by opening government. Then I think like probably there is some level of like death, and I'm probably weighing that death or the lack thereof over opening government's impact of there is less discrimination, particularly among people who are at a high level of income, and you get more people of color able to join these separated out communities. Because yeah, I still think that I think it's unreasonable for me to buy that the way that this banning happens, especially because it's not exactly mech'd out this way in Prime Minister. I think if it had been, I would have been more willing to buy it. But I think that it's unreasonable for me to say that, yeah, whenever you ban these gated communities, these people are going to move everywhere else. I think no one tells me that. I think that that like kind of comes implicitly out of Deputy. I think what I would have needed was clear modeling from Prime Minister on that specific point. But I also just think it's implausible. I think it's way more plausible that what happens is like because these communities are now banned, there is no more wall. There is no ability for them to be insular. However, they still probably live in roughly the same areas if they don't leave, because they're probably still prioritizing their own personal protection. They're probably still living in high income areas. So I don't think that you actually get that much less discrimination or that many trickle down economic impacts whenever these people are still confined to the places that are the most wealthy in the first place. Okay. So then playing in closing government. Closing government does contact theory a little bit more aggressively, right? Which is basically like they say you're probably not going to leave because it's hard to leave for a couple of reasons, right? Yeah, fair enough. Who's going to stay? High middle class. Yeah, I think this is fair. I think this is also already conceded by opening opposition. I think this is relatively reasonable. They say they can't build their own fortress. They're going to live in other areas that are safe. I think this is all relatively reasonable stuff. These are the things that I kind of had gathered from top half on what they'd agreed upon. I think in absence of like a clear model from opening government, I'm willing to default to this. I think that this is probably what every other team in this debate has like kind of said is probably true to an extent. So I think this is relatively reasonable. But then I think what they tell me is that like geeky communities aren't the standard. There's just one phenomenon. This is like there's a lot of ways that wealthy people in South America protect themselves as opposed to just gated communities. There's no need for a private militia because you can't afford it, and you also can't afford defending this private militia illegally. Also, these like neighborhoods are relatively secure. These communities are then more open, which makes them less exclusive. Then the mechanization they give me as far as like how discrimination decreases from closing government specifically is a little bit interesting. It basically is like children socialize in these insular communities. There is a lot of socialization for adults as well within these insular communities. This means that what you end up getting is insular communities of very solid voting blocks who all have discussed these things and agree on these things. Also insular communities in which children have gotten access to a higher level of safety and a higher level of like basically just being a child than other people have. This is unfair. This is uncool. We would like to redistribute this. The way that we are going to redistribute this, though, is like by removing these gated communities, which then means I think they concede like children probably aren't necessarily going to play outside anymore as much. This like decreases the level of socialization. I think in order for this case to work really cleanly, I would have needed them to accept a trade-off of like we are going to sacrifice a level of like socialization. This is just a thing that's going to happen, and this is fine because we're going to gain this other thing, which I think in this case is implicitly less discrimination. But I think the problem is you fall into a lot of the traps that opening opposition has already given you as far as why contact theory doesn't work, right? I think this comes out of the end of the deputy leader of the opposition, and I think it's relatively effective. I think what they tell me is that contact theory is like on average, or sorry, it comes out at the beginning, on average, like not really effective because discrimination exists in the first place because of fear of the other, right? Like this can look like things like employee discrimination, and it's actually going to become more explicit and it's going to be exacerbated whenever you are like removing this like veneer of safety that these people are relying so heavily on. In the first place, they're going to be more openly aggressive and discriminatory towards the people around them. I think that this is relatively reasonable, like characterization. I think the burden is on closing government to respond directly to these criticisms of the case that they are functionally pushing. I think they don't give me any reasons why these people are going to become at all more open, or why there's going to be anything other than the existing like discrimination, or even the exacerbated discrimination I'm told is coming from opening opposition. And so in that case, I think what I end up getting from them is basically like private militias are slightly less likely than I was told by opening opposition, but I think they probably still happen in some cases because I think the opening opposition characterization of them is relatively cheap, like requiring like not a ton of labor, and governments being unable to effectively restrict them in the first place is probably still fair. So I think probably private militias happen in some areas. Then children get less socialization, but I'm left uncertain as to why this is a good thing at all. And so I think this ends up like slightly hurting them, insofar as I think that they don't have much positive material that I end up crediting to a large extent. Against their opening specifically, I think the thing is they've already had some levels of the social contact theory analysis. I think even if you do expand it, I think at least in opening government, I believe that there is less discrimination between people who are already upper class and other people, like maybe people of color who are also upper class. I think in absence of this characterization from closing government, I don't know if there's any less discrimination at all that happens. And so then I think I think that's why opening government beats them, and then I think that's also why opening opposition beats them. Like if you follow the things that I've said. Okay, let's play in closing opposition. Closing opposition is fun. Closing opposition is interesting to place in this debate. Closing opposition basically tells me that gated communities are bad because they create inequality. Gated, sorry, they say they sorry. Closing opposition basically tells me that gated communities are good because they were not because they like change inequality, they like don't really address the inequality point, but because they harm cartels' abilities to operate. This ends up being like really, really important, right? Because I think what opening opposition does for me relatively conclusively is it proves to me that banning these gated communities are bad. This is a reasonable way to take this debate. I think this is completely fair. But I think what closing opposition successfully proves to me is that keeping gated communities ends up being a positive good. I think this is the weighing that comes out of opposition whip. And to be honest, I don't buy it necessarily coming out of opposition whip because I don't think it is explains the impact of this specifically. But I'm going to play out the case in its entirety and then explain how I end up weighing this. Okay. Basically, any area where a gated community exists is an area in which a cartel cannot operate. A cartel would like to operate in an area in which like it is like relatively like almost middle class-ish. It seems kind of clean because these feel like the areas in which you're less likely to like be investigated, etc. Right? So cartels ideally get to operate in areas that are like relatively empty, but like not super super low class or like super super poorer areas. However, any area that's a gated community does not fit these qualifications, so the cartel can't operate there. Also, I think they say something about like the cartel can't operate like immediately around them because gated communities have security. I think this is probably fair. So cartels have to go around them. This means two things. First of all, it means that there's less cartel activity in the areas where there are gated communities. But second of all, it limits the number of places that the cartel could potentially operate. This means that whenever the like government is sending people or like doing their relatively ineffective policing, they have fewer places they need to look for. So their relatively ineffective policing gets ever so slightly more effective, which I think manages to like explain to me why like sufficiently why gated communities are relatively positive. But I think they have a couple of other points on this as well, right? I think they explained that like whenever you have a more efficient crackdown, even if it's a moderately more efficient crackdown, you're likely to be more successful. This then trickles down to have impacts on like poorer communities or communities that suffer the most from cartel interactions in the first place. Because whenever the cartel is more crippled and be forced to engage with police slightly more, this is a positive thing. But there's also a secondary impact, which is whenever people see that these gated communities are effective, more people attempt to create gated communities. So you get more gated communities at the end of the day, even if some of them are more effective gated communities or more exclusive gated communities than other communities that exist. And then this leads like it's just a snowball effect where you end up doing that. The second thing that they tell me is like also probably cartels target rich people in order to get protection money, in order to like just get money for their financing in general, because this feels like a relatively low bar. Gated communities give like rich people the ability to collectively protect themselves. This is unique from what comes out of opening opposition, I think, because it specifically is able to explain to me what kinds of threats the gated communities are likely to be afraid of in the first place, why those threats are valid, and then how these communities actually save them. So it tells me that these gated communities are effective at doing their job in the first place, in addition to like probably not having the gated communities would cause the harms that opening opposition says. I think that overall this ends up being like more impactful for me, and I think that the bench weighing is not particularly effective, but I do think the impacts themselves are relatively effective against opening opposition. I think they're effective against both government teams for the same reason that opening opposition is effective against both government teams. But that's how the debate played out. Feel free to ask me for feedback, but I have to do judge allocations in the next 5 minutes, so I probably will not get back to you for a little bit. Thank you very much.